Greetings, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Jenny Speaks. Today, I'm offering my views on the Vybz Kartel and other appellant final appeals process. They have taken their fight to the Privy Council in a last-ditch effort to uphold their constitutional rights. I speak as a layperson, but also someone who have a extensive experience in the different levels of court system to seek justice on behalf of myself and my family. So whether it was at the Human Rights Tribunal or the Court of Appeal or Criminal Court of Appeal, for example, landlord or tenant board, I have done it successfully. I have no legal training and offer no legal advice except a few enrichment courses in law. I speak only on my experience in the court system and what is being displayed as public knowledge in the current proceedings as it relates to Vybz Kartel and others. And I'm going to make it clear here, we often hear about Vybz Kartel appeal. Keep in mind that there are 3 other persons who are currently going through the system trying to claim or reclaim their freedom. But before I submit my argument or render judgment, let me explain the role of the Privy Council in deciding Vybz Kartel and others who are now waiting for an answer to the question of were these appellants' constitutional rights violated? In other words, did the court contravene their constitutional rights to a fair trial? What is the role of the Privy Council and how does it impact Caribbean people? See, the individuals in question, Vybz Kartel and the 3 other persons, feel like they did not get a fair trial in their island. Therefore, they brought it to the UK. And so what we're looking at is what is exactly the role of the Privy Council and how does it impact Caribbean people? Now, I want to let you know that the Privy Council is King Charles' formal body of advisors. It's the highest judicial court of appeal or final court of appeal. The formal name is Judicial Committee of Privy Council. And as I said, it's the highest court of appeal in the Commonwealth. This body oversees territories, crown dependencies, and the operative here is dependencies, military sovereign base areas. Jamaica is a sovereign state of the United Kingdom, right? So this is why they're going to these individuals to decide their fate, and it's the final straw. In 1833, it was established to hear appeals in civil matter. It's the court's last resort for the entire British Empire, other than the Great Britain itself. So the judicial system or committee consists of senior judges who are called privy councillors, and they are predominantly justice of the Supreme Court of the UK. They are senior judges from the Commonwealth of Nations also. The panel of judges, typically 5, set to hear cases and report their decision. Their main duty include, but not limited to, the court, but also formally they are there to advise the sovereign on the exercise of royal duties, issue orders, so on and so forth. So let's proceed. In the case of Kartel and these 3 appellants, their current lawyer, Isat Buchanan, argues that these gentlemen were not granted a fair trial because of the number of things that occurred during trial that should have ended with a mistrial and therefore not have a guilty verdict. For anyone listening to this video, the aim is not to render a guilty or innocent verdict, but rather to examine if the constitutional rights were violated during the trial. So the court of appeal does not work with emotions. Their job at this point is not to see if he's guilty based on just evidence submitted, even though all of these things are included. But at this point, it is to examine the procedures and the balancing exercise during the trial to see if fixed judgment were addressed, how the Charter of Rights were addressed, were they in adherence to the presumption of constitutional conformity. To break this down, the court must therefore acknowledge the constitutional values in the legislative process, and by extension, the political and legal culture during these court proceedings. So this whole thing is not just about the court system itself. It encompasses the policies, it encompasses legislation and all these other things. It is a very political thing, okay? And so the court depends on the law to be able to interpret the law and so on and so forth. In other words, every citizen must be protected under the law to a fair trial. The parliament must protect the charter rights. So in the event that there is a breach of that right, the government is mandated to enforce the Charter of Rights and must therefore ensure that the judge carry out his or her duty. The judge has a duty to carry out what Buchanan referred to as the Hope test, which is this demonstrable, justifiable test. The appellants seek justice by citing the formal parts of the Constitution and the area of the 2011 amendments that was made to protect certain rights of Jamaican citizens. It's human rights jurisprudence. They're arguing that the demonstrable, justifiable test was not done because there was a breach, or maybe more than one breach, because some of the amendments to the charter could have been misinterpreted because it was relatively new during the trial. It is argued that there are things that happened during the trial that did not protect the accused. For example, the question of corruption before, during, and after the trial comes into question. For example, talks about the way how evidence was collected, and secured, and showed how these breaches resulted in an unfair conviction. So let's examine case and point. A juror was accused of accepting bribe, and this was found out when they were sequestered. When the jurors were sequestered, although the prosecutor knew and the trial judge was made aware of this, they allowed that juror to continue deliberating and thereby rendering a verdict when the court should have just dismissed this juror, but also render a mistrial verdict. But it's clear that after all that long process, they didn't want to start all over again. So they were willing to ignore the fact that what happened with those 11 jurors, they could no longer render an unbiased verdict. Nowhere in the world will a juror compromised be allowed to still remain on a jury. Nor can 10 jurors be seen as capable of rendering any fair judgment, because it takes 11 members to, enter a guilty or not guilty, because from the day of the trial until the very end, these individuals were there seeing evidence and whatever, so they couldn't technically dismiss that jury that is supposed to be corrupt. They really couldn't. But by extension, they could use the other 10 either, and they went ahead and used those persons who is saying it's not possible for them not to be biased. The head of the stream was corrupt. One must accept the body of water to be contaminated too. So if you have one juror and that person is sequestered with other persons, and that person have this unfair bias because he was paid to render a not guilty plea, then therefore he would have corrupt the whole process. So the question is asked, how did that trial judge remove the risk of bias if one jury is known to be corrupt? How can we trust that he was not able to influence the decision? Could they decide a guilty plea after they hear about the bribe? Could they just say this guy's guilty? Since men are on trial and they're relying on these 11 members of their peers to make that decision, their fate is held into these men's hands. Could they trust them to make the right choice when it's clear that certain rules were not followed, certain procedures were not followed? There was a compromise. Should the court have continued in hopes that the 10 persons would make the right decision? It doesn't work that way. Just the fact that 10 individuals voted guilty and one voted innocent And the one who voted innocent was the one who accepted bribe. Tell me a few things that I could say in conclusion. Even if these men, these 10 persons, did their due diligence and they followed the instruction of the judge or the letter to the, to the last dot, they technically cannot enter a decision that would have been fair. They needed 11 unbiased jurors. And if they're sequestered and once they are coming to the point where they're about to make a decision, they cannot go home. And so they're always together. And one of the things that came up when I look at the Privy Council, they said that they're not supervised. So how do we know that they're not having conversations? How do we know that they're not looking on the internet? How do we know that they're not talking to people outside? They're not compromised. So there's an opportunity for all kinds of things to happen that would work in contrary to them following the rules that would ensure that these men got a fair trial. And if you're going to come here emotionally to say, oh, someone died, this, that, and the other, that's not what the court looks at. The court looks at evidence and procedure. Okay, and they're saying that the question is asked, were these 11 jurors unbiased? The compromised juror halted the course of justice. Did he use jurisprudence to secure a right verdict? Did the judge, that is? Did the judge use practical wisdom about the law according to the sound theoretical principles? These are questions we're asking, that the judges are asking, the Privy Council is looking at. So many things come into question, like, for example, did Vybz Kartel and the other accused constitutional rights to a fair trial got violated? That is what they're working on now. Not if it's guilty or not guilty. In the appeal process, when you go before the appeals court, it's not to reiterate what was already presented. It's to show what was wrong, what letter of the law was not followed, what, breaches took place, right? You can't ignore that. It's not about sentimentality. Is he guilty? Is not guilty? The trial could have continued without the jurors, mind you. That is to say that the judge could have made the decision once he found out that there was someone that was compromised. He could have made the decision. But he didn't. He left it in the hand of a corrupt juror to make that decision. And anytime there is a breach, the law must be taken into account, and the judges and the prosecutor must act accordingly. And based on some of the information that came out the first day of the Privy Council, it's clear that there were, I don't know if I can call them mistakes made, but I can say that Vybz Kartel case is one of the longest criminal cases in the history of Jamaica's court proceedings. It was definitely influenced by unconscious bias from the prosecutors and other agents who worked assiduously to get a guilty verdict, to the point where they were willing to pervert the course of justice by ignoring clear examples of breaches. The collection and tampering of evidence, the securing crown witness, the perfect alignment of a rogue juror ensured a win for the prosecutors. When we see cell phone evidence, video evidence, audio information, and yet nobody was secured, yet you have a verdict of guilty, and that type of sentence, that extreme 30-something years of sentence, something is questionable. The case was predicated on circumstantial evidence and corruption throughout. It brought to our knowledge that certain procedures were not followed, as I said earlier, and as such, it leaves room for the case to be taken to this Privy Court. And you can clearly see that the line of questioning that we saw and heard, on that first day, the judges had looking at them with some side eyes. The line of questioning from the Privy Council, I'm going to repeat, we can clearly see that Vybz Kartel lawyers dropped the ball, and one has to wonder why. Anyone who practiced law would have seen the perversion of justice when corrupt and compromised jurors were allowed to enter a verdict. Who benefit from turning this blind eye? We know the powers that be was determined to put away Vybz Kartel, whether you think he's guilty or innocent. And because they were so determined to do that, They were prepared to ignore things that were contravening his rights or their rights. Jamaica has never seen such thorough research and subsequent information gathering in any other case. In fact, a lot of these cases with some of top-notch gangsters are tossed. Their perfect investigation and their procedural blunder cause us to now question if Vybz was a sacrificial lamb. Saying his constitutional rights were clearly violated. Who benefited from ignoring these technicalities? Is it possible that the corrupt juror was planted to ensure every area was covered to secure a guilty verdict? People are thinking, oh, Vybz Kartel and his people, they were the ones who bribed this person. But have you ever thought about it this way? That it could also be another thing to ensure that if A, B, C, and D doesn't work, this has to work. And this has to point to his guilt. One assumed the defense hired that juror to pervert the course of justice. But could it go the other way too? How could he have been planted to influence the jurors to say yes, he was guilty? Look at what he's trying to do. So Vybz Kartel's lawyer, Isat Buchanan, has done a fantastic job in setting some questions in the mind of the Privy Council. And they're looking according to the letter of the law to make this decision. What is going to happen as the arguments are raised to show that justice was not served? This is not to ignore the fact that people lost their loved ones. Keep that in mind. But the Court of Appeal served to examine if all statutes were followed and the citizen's right to fair trial was granted. It's a citizen's right to fair trial. It is written in the Constitution. And since we're not just going on allegations, because he was accused, I guess once a person is accused and found guilty, it's no longer allegation. But we can still use it because they're still now before the Court of Appeal. The allegations, the faulty collection of evidence, the clear human rights violation. It is only right that the court is established, the court that was established to deal with overseas or even deal with their sovereign state affairs, that they are granted the opportunity to make this final verdict. If the judges determine that there were breaches or there weren't any breaches, then the verdict will stand. But if they say the court unlawfully ignored procedures which resulted in the jurors entering unbiased decision, then they can order a retrial. But I don't think the defense wants that. I don't think they want to go back through all of that. They want the judge's decision to overturn the case and perhaps dismiss it altogether. Kartel trouble, unfortunately, will not end, even if he's released, since he has serious health battles. But can you imagine if he's released while Andrew Holness holds office? It would be a sure win for him. Does these two things have anything to do with the other? We just have to wait and see at this point. Wait to see how it's going to unfold. Wait, I think maybe within the next 6 weeks to 2 months to hear the verdict. What will it be? Someone lost their life, and these individuals are serving time. But if they're innocent, we think justice must be served. Either way, it is an all-around sad situation for everybody involved. But I don't think someone should die in prison if they're innocent. And at this point, it's not going to be about innocent, really. It's not about innocence. It's about seeing if the letter of the law was followed. And if there is anything, any open door, any opportunity to cast doubt, questionable doubt, if of their innocence, then they will walk free. And I think Isat Buchanan has done a great job in just casting doubt and using technical aspects of the trial to do this. Stay blessed, everyone.
Thanks for watching.